Welcome to another video in the series that I'm calling Difficult Passages. Really, what we're going to be looking at today in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 may not be as much a difficult passage as it is a frequently misapplied passage. And so I received a question about 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and ultimately the question is, exactly whose thoughts are being controlled or which thoughts are being controlled. And so I want to think with you about how the context of 2 Corinthians 10 or the entire context of 2 Corinthians should influence our understanding of the text in 10:1 through 5. Two things are essential in our understanding before we determine the application. One is the context of the verse, and the second is what is an accurate or a usable translation of the text. Now, as we think about the context and as we think about contextualizing the translation, the context is Paul's interaction with the Corinthians, writing to them specifically in opposition of those he identifies as super apostles. They were false teachers who had entered into the life of the Corinthian church. And so we could take the chapters from chapter 10 through chapter 13 and outline it pretty easily. In chapter 10 through 13, we have appeals concerning Paul's apostolic authority. Specifically in chapter 10, he replies to charges that have been made against him, charges of cowardice and weakness and intruding into areas where they are not his area. There is also in chapters 11 and 12 some claims that are made by Paul, his reasons for talking about these things, his freedom to minister without charge, his service, his sufferings, his special revelations, his love for them, and then finally various exhortations focused on his upcoming visit to them. Now, I want to call your attention to two translations. The first is the ESV, and I'm going to look specifically toward the end of this slide, at the bottom of the slide, to the section that has most to do with our understanding of verse 5. So beginning about midway through the slide, he says, though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. The weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh. They have divine authority to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. That's the phrase that we're specifically trying to understand. Take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete. Now, I want to compare that translation in the ESV with the translation of the New English Translation, often known as the Net Bible, and again focus specifically on the same section of text. Though we live as human beings, we do not wage war according to human standards. The weapons of our warfare are not human weapons. They're made powerful by God for tearing down strongholds. We tear down arguments and every arrogant obstacle raised up against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to make it obey Christ. And so here, I think in an analysis of the text, you will see what some of my translation preferences would be as we comment on the verses. First, in verse 1, Paul simply says that his treatment of the Corinthians is consistent with the meekness and gentleness of Christ. If he has been too meek among them, as is charged by the false teachers, his attitude is only a reflection of the Spirit of Christ, and perhaps that he wishes to give the Corinthians time to change their attitudes. In verse 2, he does not want to have to be bold among them, although he recognizes that he may have to exercise a bold confidence in dealing with the false teachers who are leveling the various accusations. But his gentleness means that he is not behaving according to human expectations. He is unlike other traveling teachers of the day. And then we come to the reading that we have previously read, both in the ESV and the NET. And depending upon the translation, and your translation may have a different way of dealing with these words, my preference would be to say we do not soldier according to human standards. And the reason, rather than wage war, the verb stratuomai, it seems to me, would be better translated to soldier, because Paul is generally talking about his work as an apostle, an arduous task in which he is fully invested. He's really not talking about a specific conflict or war or battle. So I would translate, we do not soldier for God. We do not live, we do not find ourselves involved in the daily struggles of life according to human values and norms. And since our soldiering is not according to human standards, the weapons are not human weapons. Now, they may appear to be human weapons, but they are divinely empowered for destroying or demolishing, literally, fortifications. Ocharoma, but it's always often, I should say often rather than always, it's often used of arguments that are constructed and are fortified with supporting ideas. That is a very common figurative use of this word referring to arguments. You see that when Paul uses the word arguments in the next verse. In the context, strongholds are being overcome, and they are the arguments of the false teachers or apostles, again, as is made obvious in verse 5. Verse 5, we destroy or demolish arguments, a different word, logismos. We destroy, demolish arguments and every arrogant elevation. This apparently has to do with the arrogance of the false teachers. The ESV tries to catch the idea in the phrase lofty opinions. These teachings of the false teachers oppose the knowledge of God. So in the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, the ideas that Paul wishes to capture, the ideas that Paul wishes to control, the thoughts that Paul wishes to conquer are those that are against obeying Jesus Christ. They specifically are a reference to the arguments and the teachings of the false teachers. And verse 6 says, Paul will punish disobedience, but he wants to give the Corinthians time so that they can obediently follow Christ. So we come to think about applications of this text. Without doubt, Christians should control their thinking. And there is a secondary application that can be made, urging us to control our own personal thinking. But I would suggest to you that that is not the primary subject in view in this text, and should not be our primary application. Our first task should be to understand 2 Corinthians 10 in the context of Paul's writing to the Corinthians, specifically dealing with the false teachers. Paul's topic is the false teachers, whose arguments are opposed to knowing Jesus Christ. The arguments that they are raising are opposed to developing a relationship of knowledge of Christ. They are substituting allegiance to the teachers to themselves. They are substituting an allegiance to the teachers for an allegiance to the master teacher. Paul wanted to destroy such false arguments. He wanted to undo and demolish their arrogance by taking captive, controlling, or perhaps the best translation, conquering every thought. Paul's purpose was to exalt Christ and to exalt the knowledge of Christ and to encourage the Corinthians toward obedience of Christ. So we also oppose all teaching that opposes the need to know God and to know Christ. We avoid arrogance. We distinguish Bible teaching from human arguments. We seek to soldier according to God's power and God's standard so that we might be fully obedient to Jesus Christ. And yes, in our understanding of God's Word, we seek also, always, to let God's thinking control our thinking. May God bless you in your study of God's Word. May these studies be helpful as we seek to understand the Bible in the context of the original writer and make applications in our life that can make a difference in how we live.